Welcome back. For most of this course, we have been asking a certain kind of question. What is the good? What makes an action right? And nearly every theory we have looked at has answered in a similar way. It has tried to hand us a principle, a rule, something we could apply fairly and equally to everyone. The utilitarian says, for example, that we should maximize happiness, counting each person as one. The natural law theorist tells us to act in accordance with what seems to be an idealized version of the perfect man. The deontological ethicist says that we are to act only on a principle that we could will for everyone. Even the way most speak of justice functions in this way. We say that we should treat people equally and fairly, not to play favorites, and that we should be impartial. This understanding of justice paints a picture of what we call a good moral reasoner, a fair judge who is calm, neutral, moved by personal feeling, and applies the rule the same way to a stranger as to his own brother. Now, today, we are going to look at a different theory that stops and asks whether that picture was ever the whole story in the first place. It is called care ethics. So let me first speak of the origin of care ethics, since the context will help us to understand what it is. In the late 20th century, a researcher and feminist ethicist named Carol Gilligan studied how people grew up morally. The leading model at the time ranked moral maturity by how well a person reasoned with abstract, universal principles. The higher you climb towards impartial, universal rules, the more morally mature you were said to be. Yet there was something very odd in the data. When the girls were tested against this model, they kept scoring lower than the boys. Now you can read that result in two ways. One way is just to conclude that girls are simply less morally developed, but that doesn't seem true. The researcher thought that conclusion was suspicious, so she wondered whether the problem was not with the girls, but the test, a test that only counted one style of moral thinking as real thinking. So Gallagher tried to attend more closely to the data. In doing so, she noticed that the girls were not failing to morally reason at all. They were reasoning differently. Let's look at an example the children themselves were given. A man's wife is dying. There is one drug that can save her, but he cannot afford it. So the question is this: should he steal it? One child answers it like a math problem. A life is worth more than money, so yes, he should steal it. This answer seems clean, logical, and very rule based. Another child hesitates and starts asking other questions. Well, if he steals it and goes to prison, who takes care of his wife then? Isn't there some way to talk to the druggist and work something out? Now, on the test, the first answer scores higher. But look carefully at the second child. She is not failing to solve the puzzle. Rather, she is seeing the whole web of relationships stretched out over time. She refuses to reduce ethics to clean mere rules. The researcher Gilligan then called this second way of reasoning the voice of care, as opposed to the voice of justice. And her claim was that this care voice was not less mature. It was a legitimate and largely ignored way of thinking about morality. So then what is care ethic? At its heart are a few key claims. The first is that we are not, deep down, isolated individuals. Most theories quietly imagine the moral agent as an independent adult, freely making choices on his own. But think about our own actual lives. We began as helpless infants who would have died without someone caring for us. When we grow older, we will most likely become dependent again. In between infancy and old age, we find ourselves tangled in a web of family, friends, and people who need us as we need them. Care ethics says that this, dependence and connection, is the real human condition. not lonely self-sufficiency. The second claim follows from the first. Because we are bound to particular people, those relationships carry real moral weight. You genuinely owe your closest friend or your mother things you do not owe a stranger. And care ethics takes that seriously rather than treating it as a bias to be corrected. The third claim is that emotions are not the enemy of moral reasoning. Compassion and empathy are part of how we actually perceive a situation rightly in the first place. And then finally, the fourth key point is that a single master rule is not enough. What matters is paying attention to the particular people actually in front of you and responding to them. Now, this theory is usually called a feminist ethic, and that word causes more confusion than almost any other in this unit. So let's clear that up. When we say feminist here, we do not mean the claim that men and women are simply the same, equally capable of all the same things if they would only put their minds to it. That is only one strand of feminist thought, but it is not this one. There are different strands of feminism. Care ethics belongs to a different one, and the sense in which it is feminist is this. Think about whose life had, for most of history, been filled with the work of care, the raising of children, the tending of the sick, the looking after of the aging. That work was largely assigned to women. And notice that this entire sphere of human life was exactly what the grand moral theories tended to wave off as unimportant, mere private, individual matters. So the feminist observation was that the moral world of care had been unfairly dismissed, and that its dismissal ran along the lines of who had been assigned to it. So the word feminist here describes where the theory came from and what unfairness it was reacting against, not the content of its claims. The actual claims of care ethics are these: that we are relational, that emotions inform our moral perception, that context matters, and that we are interdependent. Care ethics is not a gender-based ethics, even though its origin came about through studying the biases and how men and women react to ethics. So care ethics is an ethics for all human beings. Care ethics is feminist in its origin and its motivation, but applicable to all in what it actually teaches. Now, we have to ask, why do people find this view so compelling? For one, it shows that human beings are codependent on one another, and in this sense, it best accounts for society. We can think of it in this way. If ethics were about individual living and did not focus on the community in some way, then we could just live in isolation and that would be fine. But morality doesn't seem to be something lived out in isolation. For example, we say that justice is giving somebody what they deserve. But if we are just beings who are sufficient to live, if we are just beings who are sufficient to live in isolation, then we wouldn't need justice because there would be no other to give what they deserve. There would only be us in isolation. So care ethics then accounts for the fact that we are social beings. Secondly, care ethics wants us to see the nuance of ethics, of how not everything is either black or white. Let's take impartiality as an example. We tend to think that if we are just, we shouldn't play favorites. But we have to ask, is that true? Let's take an example. So let's picture a father who announces that in order to be perfectly fair, he will treat his own daughter exactly as he treats every other child on earth, with no special care or attention. We would not admire that father. We would not call him a model of fairness. We think something has gone wrong with him, in fact. The relationship between parent and child creates a special obligation that his impartiality breaks. What this reveals is that there is a whole region of the moral life, a region of love, loyalty, and particular attachment that an ethics of impartial rules cannot easily account for. And so, how does care ethics relate to the theories we have already learned? Its closest relative, by far, seems to be virtue ethics. Both refuse to reduce morality to mere rules. Both trust the judgment of a good person reading a particular situation. Both put character and relationship near the center. In fact, many philosophers argue that care ethics is simply a form of virtue ethics, with care as one of the central virtues. Its sharpest opponents, on the other hand, are deontological ethics and utilitarianism. These are the most impartial, the most rule driven of our theories, and they are exactly what care ethics is pushing against. The deontologist's lone, autonomous, rational agent is precisely the isolated self that care ethics says never really existed. And the utilitarians demand that we count every person equally, including total strangers, is exactly the impartiality that care ethics says can become morally blind. There is one other relation worth naming. It may be tempting to think that an ethics that refuses universal rules must collapse into relativism. But care ethics explicitly rejects that. It does not say anything goes. It says that responding well to real people in real relationships is genuinely better than responding badly, that cruelty and neglect are really wrong, not just disapproved of. Care ethics refuses abstract rules precisely because we are concrete persons in relation with one another. Now, of course, no ethical theory is without its own potential weak spots. Let's return to the two children and the dilemma about the drug, this time with a critical eye. We said the girl who is worried about the relationships was not failing to reason. She looked at the abstract justice answer, the answer that a life outweighs property, so steal the drug, and judged it to be the shallower answer. She could have given that answer, but she did not. She chose not to because she thought it missed what actually mattered. Now let's sit with that for a moment. If she is judging one answer to be shallow and another to be deep, that judgment is coming from somewhere. It might, we could say, be coming from a bias of relationship over rule. The child who gave the abstract justice answer is answering from his own bias. And so neither child is a neutral judge standing above the two voices. Each is judging within bias or within their own biases. Now, to be clear, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I am actually not saying that all biases are bad. Everybody has a bias. If we think we shouldn't be biased, then that itself is a bias against biases. So I'm not saying that we are to just get rid of all biases. Rather, we have to be aware of them and judge whether they are good biases or bad ones. And that's what we're going to test here. So we have to ask, why are the children in the study biased in different ways? Where did their biases come from? We could say that the bias came from biology. That's one possible answer. But then care ethics is not an ethics for all. It merely reports a fact about our biological wiring, and it forfeits its right to being an ethical theory. Ethical theories are things that we can consider and either accept or reject, but our biology is not. We could also say that the biases came from how the boy and the girl were raised. This could account for the biases, but it does not tell us whether they are right or wrong biases. So it is not clear whether care ethics explains right and wrong living, or is it just another kind of bias? Right? And that's just a different possible view. Again, I'm not saying that care ethics takes the view that these biases merely come from how the boy and the girl were raised. We're just looking at the possible answers. Third, we could say that the two answers are simply two lenses available to anyone. But to choose which lens to view an ethical claim through is itself an ethical act. I'll say that again because that's a key point. To choose which lens to view an ethical claim through is itself an ethical act. We do not first choose a lens and then engage in ethics. Rather, we already live lives of ethics. So we cannot be They cannot be lenses that we put on and take off like glasses. Finally, we could say that these are two different accounts of ethics, one closer to the truth than the other. In this case, care ethics becomes plausible, but now we must ask, which theory is right? No head count settles that. If majority made something true, if the majority rule made something true, then the Earth was once the center of the solar system and then stopped being so when opinion changed, which seems absurd. Psychology can give us insight into this question, but it cannot tell us which ethical theory is true. Here, our overarching question returns once more. What does it mean to live the good life? So, where does this leave us? Care ethics has done something valuable, something I do not want us to lose sight of. It has recovered a whole voice that our other theories had gone deaf to. The voice that asks not only what is fair, but who is connected to who is vulnerable here, and what do we actually owe one another. It has reminded us that we are not lone individuals, but people bound together in need and care, and that an ethics blind to that is missing something real. And yet, it has also led us, as every honest theory in this course eventually has, back to the same foundational question. If there truly are two ways of thinking about ethics based on our biases, and we want to say they are of equal worth, why choose one over the other? If they are equal, then does it matter which we choose? This is the apparent tension that we have to sit with. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.